So here's a little video on explaining imaginary numbers. One of the many things we need to learn today. When you take the square root of a negative number, your answer is imaginary. Okay? When you take the square root of a negative number, your answer is imaginary. Fact, the square root of -1 is I. Once again, the square root of -1 is the letter I. It's the variable I. And that's what I'm explaining right here. Now see, the thing is this. If I ask you, what is the square root of 9? What do you say? 3. Why is the answer 3? Because 3 times 3 is 9. Now, if I said, what's the square root of -9? It's not 3, and it's not -3 either. Because if you go -3 times -3, it doesn't give you -9. -3 times -3 is +9. See how that doesn't work? So the fact is, there's no number that you could multiply with itself that'll give you -9. There's no real number, at least. It's an imaginary number. Okay? So what we need to do from here on out is whenever we see a negative sign on the inside of the root, it's going to end up producing the variable I on the outside. Now the correct work to show would be this. I'm going to rewrite -9. I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of -1 times the square root of 9. And then you split the root, and of course up here it says the square root of -1 is equal to I. So this guy really becomes I times the square root of 9, and the square root of 9 is really 3. And if you say I times 3, your answer is 3I. Now all of this work is kind of unnecessary because all you have to recognize is that the negative sign in the front is going to produce an I. Are you with me? Yeah. So here's some examples. The square root of -9, the answer is 3I. That's it. It's not nonsense. It's imaginary. It's not real. So when I do the square root of -49, what's my answer going to be? 7I. All you're doing is that negative sign in there becomes an I. I'm sorry. That negative sign becomes an I on the outside.
Instead of going in front of the number, it goes one at a time.
Yeah. Because when you take a variable, like if I say x times 3, you're not going to say x3, you're going to say 3x, right? So let me zoom in and let me actually write the explanation for number 1 right here. Like what you're supposed to do, at least a couple of times, is rewrite -9, rewrite it as -1 times 9, and then you could split the root, and then you could say the square root of -1, that's really I, and the square root of 9 is really 3, so the answer is 3I. The explanation for number 2 is that -49 could be rewritten as -1 times 49. You could split the root, and the square root of -1, that's really I, the square root of 49 is 7, so I times 7 is 7I. Now, of course, it would be kind of silly to be showing all that work. I'm just doing it so you could completely understand. So let's not show work on number 3. What's the answer to number 3? 9I. Now, number 4 is a little different because it's 4I. No. If you have
4, 1/2 I.
Okay. Now, it's not a perfect square number. It's not a perfect square number. So I need to, it'd probably be a good idea to show my work here. I'm going to rewrite -8 as -1 times 8, and I am going to split the root. In other words, the negative in here is just going to produce an I on the outside. So I will have I times whatever I get from my answer on the square root of 8. Now, 8 breaks down to 4 times 2, and when you split the root, you'll end up with 2 square root of 2. Now think about this. You have I times 2 times the square root of 2. So that's like saying x times 2. What's x times 2? It's 2x. What's I times 2? It's 2i. So your answer, the correct order of the answer should be 2i square root of 2. That's the correct order of the answer, the organization. Now, let's go back. Let's do a couple more of these. number 5, let me make more space. Number 5, see, what's this negative sign going to produce? An I on the outside. So I know that I could rewrite this as I on the outside, and now on the inside I have the regular square root of 32. And you go about simplifying square root of 32 the way we normally would. So how would I break down the square root of 32? 16 times 2. Of course, you want to use the biggest perfect square number. 16's it. So we're going to split the root now. Let's not forget about the I that remains in the front that I need to multiply at the very end. And the square root of 16 is 4. No more square root. I still need to multiply it by I, and then I need to put the square root of 2 at the very end. So what is I times 4? 4I. Square root of 2 at the very end. You get it? Yeah. Okay, so how about number 6? Here's the explanation on number 6. Now we know that the negative sign in the front, I could just move it out and make it an I. And the square root of 24 is what's left. No more negative. It's just 24. Now you want to break that down with multiplication to get a perfect square number. So I want to go 4 times 6. 4 times 6 is 24. And 4 is a perfect square number. So I have the I have the square root of 4. And the square root of 4 is really 2. So let me go I times 2. And then at the very end, bring down the square root of 6. I times 2 is 2I. And then the square root of 6 at the very end. That is my final answer. Now, if you're thinking, what about 6? Could I break that down to 2 times 3? I mean, you could, but neither of those are perfect square numbers, so it's already as simple as it gets. That's your answer. Let's move on to number 7. What's the only thing you could do when you're simplifying the square root of negative 7? Rewrite it as? A positive. Okay, so what's my answer going to be? This negative, okay, let me show my work, just so nobody gets confused. On the inside, I have negative 1 times 7, right? And when I split the root, I have negative 1 times square root of 7. Square root of negative 1 times square root of negative square root of 7. And then, the square root of negative 1 is what? I.
I square root of 7.
I square root of 7. That's it. I square root of 7. Yep. And of course, the shortcut we've been doing is simply take the negative sign and write it as I on the outside. See, I didn't show this work right here. I just took the negative sign, wrote it as an I on the outside.
Pretty cool.
Okay, now number 8, what's the answer going to be?
8.
What's number 8?
I squared
4.
I?
4I.
4I? 4I?
Negative 4.
Negative 4I.
It's just negative 4, guys. There is no I. There's no I. Now, think about it.
Just when it's inside.
Yeah, it's only when the negative's on the inside that you get something imaginary. Now, right here, it says the square root of 16 with the negative sign in front. What's the square root of 16? It's 4. Put the negative sign in front. There it is. Your answer is negative 4. Okay? So, this is a somewhat smaller video on imaginary numbers. And imaginary numbers come from the square root of negative 1. And we're going to pick up on the next video with the next topic, which is simplifying square roots that have fractions in them.